The room was silent, but not the kind of calm silence. This silence was heavy, thick. It clung to everyone, making it hard to breathe. Every chair was filled, every eye focused on the man at the center of it all. Sergeant Nathan Carter sat in his wheelchair, his uniform neat, his medals shining under the harsh lights. He looked strong, but his hands, gripping the leash of the dog beside him, trembled. The dog, Thor, sat still, his eyes scanning the room. To most, he was just a military dog. To Nathan, he was everything. The judge's voice broke the stillness. Sergeant Carter, this is your last chance to speak. The Army has decided Thor is to be reassigned. Nathan clenched his jaw. His heart pounded in his chest as he struggled to find the words. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but raw with emotion. Your Honor, Thor isn't just a dog. He's my partner. He's my family. He paused, his grip on the leash tightening. He saved my life, again and again. On the battlefield, he pulled me out of danger, warned me of traps, and shielded me from gunfire. Nathan's voice cracked. He swallowed hard and continued. But it's more than that. When I came home, when I couldn't even look at myself in the mirror, Thor was there. He kept me going. Please don't take him from me. The room stayed quiet, but it wasn't the same silence as before. This one was filled with tension. People exchanged glances. Some wiped their eyes. The judge leaned back, his face hard to read. He opened his mouth to speak. But before he could, Thor stood up. Nathan's hand slipped from the leash as Thor barked sharply, the sound cutting through the room like a blade. Gasps filled the air. The bailiffs stiffened, stepping closer. Thor wasn't growling. He wasn't angry. But his bark was strong, urgent, like he was trying to warn them about something. Thor? Nathan's voice shook. His heart raced. He knew this behavior. He had seen it before in places far from here. Thor wasn't just barking. He was signaling danger. The murmurs grew louder. What's wrong with the dog? Someone whispered. Nathan pushed his wheelchair forward. His voice broke as he shouted, He's not just barking. He does this when something's wrong. He's trying to warn us. The judge froze, his gavel hanging in the air. Thor's barking grew louder, sharper. His body was low, his eyes locked on something no one else could see. The tension in the room grew unbearable. This wasn't over. Something was coming. The sharp echo of Thor's bark lingered in the air, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. All eyes were on him now. The dog's stance was low, muscles tight, ears pinned back. His focus was locked on the judge's bench, and his barks became louder, sharper. Nathan's chest tightened. His voice trembled as he called out, Thor, heel! But Thor didn't listen. He didn't glance back. Nathan gripped the arms of his wheelchair, his knuckles turning white. He had seen this before. Too many times. On the battlefield, this was the moment just before everything went wrong. The room grew restless. People shifted in their seats, uneasy whispers rippling through the crowd. One voice rose from the back. What's wrong with the dog? Thor's barks turned to low growls, deep and guttural. The sound sent shivers through the room. Even the bailiffs exchanged nervous glances. Nathan's voice broke through the noise, louder now, firm with urgency. He's not just barking. He's trained to sense danger, bombs, explosives, things we can't see. He's warning us. The judge's face remained stiff, his gavel forgotten in his hand. Mr. Carter, he said sharply, though his tone faltered. Control your dog or I will... Thor interrupted him, lunging forward. The leash yanked hard against Nathan's grip, almost pulling him out of his chair. The growls deepened as Thor's body shifted toward the back of the room, his eyes snapping to the heavy wooden doors. The murmurs turned into louder whispers, fear spreading through the spectators like wildfire. Someone muttered, Is there something out there? Nathan's heart pounded. He wheeled himself closer to Thor, his voice shaking but clear. Everyone needs to stay calm, he said. though even he didn't believe his own words. The tension in the room was suffocating. Thor's focus on the doors was unrelenting, his growls vibrating through the air. The judge finally spoke, his voice edged with unease. "Bailiffs, check the doors." The larger bailiff, his hand resting on his holstered weapon, stepped forward. His movements were slow, cautious. His partner followed, gripping a flashlight in one hand, the beam shaking slightly as it cut through the dimly lit courtroom. Nathan's stomach twisted. He knew this feeling, this moment of waiting. On the battlefield, it was the pause just before something exploded, just before lives changed forever. Thor's barking grew more frantic, more insistent. His claws scraped the polished floor as he strained against the leash, his body coiled like a spring. The larger bailiff reached the door, his hand hovering over the handle. He glanced back at the judge, his face pale. "It's probably nothing," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Nathan leaned forward, his heart racing. "It's not nothing," he called out, his voice loud and firm. "If Thor's acting like this, there's a reason." The room went silent, the kind of silence that feels too loud. The bailiff's hand wrapped around the handle, and the door creaked as he pulled it open. At first there was nothing, just a dim hallway stretching into the shadows. The smaller bailiff stepped forward, his flashlight beam scanning the empty corridor. "There's nothing here," he said, though his words sounded unsure. But Thor didn't stop. His barking grew louder, more frantic, his body straining harder against the leash. And then, the sound came. It was faint at first, a metallic clang echoing down the hallway. It wasn't loud, but in the thick silence of the room, it was deafening. The smaller bailiff flinched, his flashlight beam jerking wildly. "What was that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Thor's growls turned feral. He lunged forward, his claws screeching against the floor. Nathan barely managed to hold on, his hands shaking as he tightened his grip on the leash. The metallic sound came again, louder this time, closer. Panic rippled through the crowd. People shifted nervously in their seats, some clutching their belongings as though that would protect them. Nathan's voice cut through the chaos. "Get away from the door!" he shouted, his tone sharp and commanding. "Thor's never wrong! Something's coming!" The bailiffs froze, their eyes darting toward the hallway. The larger one tightened his grip on his weapon, stepping cautiously into the corridor. His partner followed, their movements slow, deliberate. Thor's barking reached a fever pitch, echoing through the room like an alarm. Nathan's breath quickened. His gut told him this wasn't just another warning. Something was there, and it was getting closer. The metallic clang echoed again, louder this time, sending a wave of unease through the room. The courtroom, once filled with murmurs, fell deathly silent. All eyes were on the hallway beyond the open doors, the dim light barely illuminating the polished floor. Thor's growls deepened, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate through the walls. His body was rigid, his focus unshaken. Nathan's pulse quickened as he strained to keep Thor from lunging forward. The larger bailiff stepped cautiously into the hallway, his weapon drawn. "There's nothing here," he muttered, though his voice carried doubt. His partner followed, the flashlight beam darting nervously across the empty corridor. Nathan's breath caught in his throat. He knew this feeling. It was too quiet, too still. The smaller bailiff, gripping the flashlight tighter, muttered under his breath. "Probably just the dog reacting to something. A sound or... I don't know." But his hands trembled. Thor barked sharply, cutting through the air like a warning shot. Nathan's voice rose, trembling but firm. "No, he doesn't react to just noise. He's trained. If Thor's growling like this, there's a reason." The tension in the room was suffocating. Spectators shifted nervously in their seats, their unease growing with each passing second. A woman clutched her bag tightly, whispering to the person beside her. "What's happening? What's out there?" Thor's eyes locked on the far end of the hallway, his growls turning into a sharp, relentless bark. Nathan leaned forward in his wheelchair, his stomach twisting into knots. "Something's wrong," he whispered to himself. And then, the shadow moved. It was faint, just a flicker at the edge of the light, but it was enough. The smaller bailiff gasped audibly, his flashlight beam jerking as he stumbled back. "Did you see that?" he hissed. The larger bailiff froze, his weapon snapping up, aimed into the darkness. "Who's there?" he barked, his voice loud and commanding. But there was no answer, only silence. Thor lunged forward again, almost yanking the leash from Nathan's grasp. His barking grew frantic, desperate. The metallic clang came again, followed by the unmistakable sound of a heavy footstep. Slow, deliberate. Each step echoing louder than the last. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Spectators jumped from their seats, some heading for the exits, others frozen in fear. The judge slammed his gavel, his voice cracking as he yelled, "Everyone stay calm!" But no one was calm. Nathan wheeled himself closer to Thor, gripping the leash tightly. His voice rose above the noise. "Get back! Get out of the hallway!" The larger bailiff didn't move. His gun remained trained on the dark corridor as he took another step forward. The smaller bailiff hesitated, his flashlight beam shaking as he tried to steady his nerves. And then it came again, a footstep, louder this time, closer. Thor's snarls grew feral, his body straining against the leash like he was ready to charge. Nathan's voice trembled as he called out, "Thor, no!" But deep down, he knew. Thor wasn't reacting out of fear. He was ready to defend. The larger bailiff glanced back toward the room, his face pale. "There's something out here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The judge's voice cracked as he leaned forward in his chair. "What do you mean, something? Do you see anything?" "I don't know," the bailiff admitted, his eyes darting back to the shadows. "But it doesn't feel right." The smaller bailiff stepped closer to his partner, his flashlight sweeping the hallway. "It's empty," he muttered, though his tone carried no conviction. "There's nothing here." But Thor didn't stop. His barking was relentless, his body coiled like a spring. Nathan tightened his grip on the leash, his voice breaking. He knows. He always knows. And then the shadow moved again. This time, it was unmistakable. A figure stepped into the edge of the light, slow and deliberate. The bailiffs froze. The room held its breath. The figure stood still, just out of focus, their face obscured. They didn't speak, didn't move closer, but the way they stood, calm and deliberate, sent a chill through the room. Thor's barking reached a fever pitch, and Nathan's heart raced. He didn't know who or what this was, but he knew one thing. This wasn't over. The figure stepped closer, the dim light casting long shadows over their frame. They moved slowly, deliberately, like they wanted every eye in the room to stay on them. A hood obscured their face, and their hands were tucked into the pockets of a heavy coat. The bailiffs tensed, their weapons drawn, but the figure showed no fear. The smaller bailiff's flashlight beam trembled as he whispered, "Who are you?" The figure didn't respond right away. Instead, they took another step forward, calm and confident, their boots clicking softly on the tiled floor. Thor erupted into barking again, his body lunging forward so violently that Nathan's grip on the leash almost slipped. "Thor, no!" Nathan called, his voice cracking. But Thor wasn't stopping. His eyes were locked on the figure, and his growls were guttural, primal. Nathan's chest tightened. This wasn't just a warning bark. Thor was ready to attack. The larger bailiff stepped forward, his gun aimed directly at the figure. "Stop right there! Show your hands!" The figure finally spoke, their voice low, smooth, and unsettling. "Relax," they said, the word lingering in the air like a warning. "I'm not here to hurt anyone." But there was no warmth in their tone, only calm, cold confidence. The courtroom was frozen. The spectators, once panicking, now stood still, their fear making them silent. Even the judge, gavel still in hand, didn't speak. Nathan's heart pounded as he stared at the figure. Something about them felt wrong, deeply wrong. His grip on Thor's leash tightened. "You've caused enough chaos," the judge finally said, his voice trembling slightly. "Identify yourself, or I'll have you removed." The figure tilted their head slightly, as if amused. They took another slow step forward, and this time the light revealed the faintest hint of a smirk on their face. "I'm not here for any of you," the figure said, their tone almost conversational. Their eyes flicked to Thor. "I'm here for the dog." The words hit Nathan like a punch. Thor's growls grew louder, his body straining harder against the leash. Nathan wheeled himself forward, his voice rising. "You're not taking him!" The figure didn't flinch. "Thor isn't just a dog, Sergeant Carter," they said smoothly. "You know that. He's special. He sees things others can't. He senses what's coming before it happens. That's why I need him." Nathan's jaw tightened. His mind raced. How did this person know about Thor? About what he could do? "You don't know anything about him," Nathan shot back, his voice edged with anger. The smirk on the figure's face widened. "Don't I?" Before Nathan could respond, the figure raised a hand slowly. The bailiffs stiffened, their weapons still trained on them. "Don't move!" one of them barked, his voice sharp with tension. But the figure ignored them, keeping their movements slow and deliberate. "I'm not here to argue," they said, their tone calm but laced with authority. "I'm just here to take what's mine." "Thor doesn't belong to you," Nathan snapped. "He's my partner, my family." The figure's smirk faltered for a moment, replaced by something colder. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," they said. Their gaze shifted back to Thor, who was still growling ferociously. "But I don't have time for this." Nathan's grip on the leash tightened as he wheeled himself even closer to Thor. His voice was firm, unwavering. "You're not taking him," he said. The figure studied Nathan for a long moment, their expression unreadable. Then, with a small motion, they gestured toward the doors. And that's when two more figures stepped into the room. The crowd gasped. These new figures were dressed similarly, their faces hidden in shadows. They moved silently, their presence adding an almost unbearable weight to the room. One of them held a long metallic object, something sharp, gleaming faintly in the light. The other had their hand on a weapon strapped to their side. Nathan's heart raced as he looked from one figure to the next. Thor's barking grew louder, more frantic, his body straining harder against the leash. "What is this?" the judge demanded, his voice breaking slightly. "Who are you people?" The first figure didn't answer. Instead, they turned back to Nathan. "Thor isn't safe with you," they said. "You can't protect him from what's coming, but I can." Nathan's chest tightened. His voice rose, filled with both fear and determination. "You don't know anything about me," he said, "and you're not taking him." The figure stepped closer, their voice lowering. "This isn't about you, Sergeant. This is about the future, and Thor is the key to it." Nathan stared at them, his mind racing. He didn't know what they meant, but one thing was clear. They weren't leaving without a fight. The judge slammed his gavel, his voice shaking. "Bailiffs, remove them from my courtroom immediately!" The larger bailiff stepped forward, his weapon still raised. "You heard him," he said, his voice firm. "Hands where I can see them." But the figure didn't move. Their smirk returned, colder this time. "This isn't over," they said softly. "We'll be back." And with that, they motioned to their companions. The three figures backed toward the door, their movements slow and deliberate. Thor's barking didn't stop until the doors closed behind them. Nathan's hands trembled as he gripped the leash, his chest heaving. Whatever this was, it wasn't just about Thor. It was bigger, much bigger. The courtroom was silent again, but this silence was different. It was thick with fear, confusion, and questions no one dared to voice. The strangers had left, but their presence lingered, like a shadow no one could shake. Thor finally sat, his growls fading, but his body remained tense, his eyes fixed on the door as though waiting for the threat to return. Nathan's chest rose and fell with heavy breaths, his hands still gripping the leash tightly. The judge slumped back in his chair, the gavel resting limply in his hand. His usual commanding presence was gone, replaced by a pale, shaken expression. "This court is adjourned," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Spectators began to stir, whispers rippling through the room like a low hum of unease. Some clutched their belongings, others hurried toward the exits. "Who were they?" a woman whispered as she gripped her husband's arm. "What did they want with the dog?" "I don't know," he muttered back, his voice edged with fear. "But it's not over, that's for sure." Nathan stayed where he was, unmoving, his eyes locked on the doors. His mind raced, replaying every moment, every word the stranger had spoken. "Thor isn't safe with you. He's the key to the future." "What does that even mean?" Nathan murmured to himself, his voice barely above a whisper. Thor glanced up at him, his sharp eyes meeting Nathan's as if to say, "I've got you." The larger bailiff approached cautiously, his face still pale. "Are you all right, Sergeant?" he asked, his voice low. Nathan nodded stiffly, though his hands trembled slightly as he reached down to pet Thor's head. "I'm fine," he said, though he didn't believe it himself. "But this isn't over." The bailiff hesitated, glancing at the door, then back at Nathan. "Whoever they were," he said, "they're not done with you." "Be careful." Nathan's jaw tightened. His grip on Thor's leash never loosened. "I know," he said firmly. The crowd continued to file out of the courtroom, their footsteps echoing off the wooden floors. The whispers grew fainter, replaced by a tense quiet as the room emptied. Nathan leaned back in his wheelchair, his shoulders heavy with exhaustion. Thor sat close to him, his body pressed against Nathan's leg. The dog's presence was steady, grounding, a reminder that he wasn't alone. He reached down and gently ran a hand over Thor's fur. "You did good, buddy," he said softly. His voice carried a mix of relief and determination. "Real good." But even as the weight of the moment settled over him, Nathan's thoughts were already shifting forward. The strangers had said they would return. Whatever this was, whatever they wanted, it wasn't over. Nathan's eyes narrowed as he looked at the door one more time. Let them come, he thought. They'll have to go through both of us. Thor let out a low whine, leaning into Nathan's hand. For the first time all day, Nathan allowed himself to breathe. For now they had won. The hallway outside the courtroom was dim, the flickering lights casting uneven shadows on the walls. The strangers moved with deliberate calm, their steps echoing in the silence. The leader stopped near a corner, turning to face the other two. The smirk he'd worn inside the courtroom was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. "He's stronger than I thought," he muttered, his voice low. "But it doesn't matter. We'll get the dog." One of the figures, their face hidden by a hood, shifted uneasily. "Are you sure about this? That dog... It's not normal." Their voice trembled slightly, betraying fear. The leader turned to them, his piercing gaze cutting through the shadows. "Of course it's not normal," he snapped. "That's the point. Thor isn't just any dog. He's the key, and we need him before it's too late." The third figure, silent until now, leaned against the wall, their voice calm but sharp. "Carter won't give him up. You saw it in there. He'll fight us." The leader's lips curled into a faint smile. "Then we'll make him." A metallic sound echoed as the leader reached into his coat, pulling out the same key he'd shown in the courtroom. He held it up, its cold surface glinting faintly in the dim light. "This is just the beginning," he said softly. "Soon, they'll all understand." Behind him, the shadows seemed to shift, almost alive, as the group disappeared into the darkness. Inside the courtroom, Nathan remained seated, his eyes still locked on the door as if expecting it to swing open again at any moment. The once crowded room was now empty, the faint hum of air conditioning the only sound. Thor sat by his side, calm now but alert. His ears twitched at every small sound, his eyes scanning the room as if sensing something Nathan couldn't. Nathan leaned forward in his wheelchair, resting his elbows on his knees. His hands still trembled slightly, but his mind was focused. The stranger's words played on a loop in his head. "Thor isn't safe with you. He's special. He's the key to the future." Nathan frowned, his jaw tightening. He didn't know what they meant or why they wanted Thor, but one thing was clear. They wouldn't stop. He glanced down at Thor, who was staring back at him with the same steady gaze he always had. Nathan reached down, his hand brushing over the dog's head. "We'll be ready, buddy," he murmured. "Whatever's coming, we'll face it together." Thor's ears perked up, and he let out a soft huff, his tail wagging once before settling back against Nathan's leg. The door at the back of the courtroom creaked open, and Nathan's head snapped up. A bailiff stepped inside, his face drawn and pale. "Sergeant Carter," he said cautiously. "They're gone. For now." Nathan nodded but didn't relax. "They'll be back," he said firmly, his tone carrying more certainty than fear. The bailiff hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I think you're right." As the door closed again, leaving Nathan and Thor alone in the room, the lights flickered faintly. For a moment, the shadows on the walls seemed to move, stretching and twisting unnaturally. Nathan's hand instinctively tightened on Thor's leash. "Not today," he muttered under his breath. "You're not taking him. Not now. Not ever." Thor's ears perked up again, his body tense. Nathan followed his gaze toward the windows at the far end of the room. Outside, the city lights glowed dimly, but something felt off. Nathan didn't know when they would come back. He didn't know what they wanted or how far they'd go to get it. But he knew one thing for certain. They weren't just after Thor. They were after something bigger. And whatever it was, Nathan would fight to protect the one being who had never let him down. The room fell into silence again, the flickering lights casting an eerie glow. Thor shifted slightly, his eyes still locked on the door. The storm was coming, and Nathan was ready. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned for more, and we'll see you in the next story.